So, hello everyone, and as Karen was saying, we are going to try to make this as interactive as possible. So to kick things off, first of all, my name is Lucye Provera. I am the Pay Equity, Pay Transparency, and DEI Leader for Europe and UK. I'm based in Milan, but working across Europe and helping companies for really the past 6 years on their global pay equity strategy, the different gender pay compliance requirements, and now more and more with pay transparency. Joined here today with Lucy.
Another Lucy. Yeah, there's lots of us Lucys. So I'm based in the UK. I work in our DEI and pay equity team on everything DEI and pay equity related with a background in rewards. So with that focus on the UK and what we're doing in the UK, but also the impacts on obviously everything that's going on in Europe on broader European and EMEA approaches to things.
And so the way we're set up, we have, myself as a regional leader. There's also another regional leader in Denmark. We have country experts like Lucy in each of our different European locations. So if you have specific countries about Sweden or France, feel free to reach out. We also have a very strong Center of Excellence team that helps us with the data and analytics, just to give that the background. So I promised things would be interactive, and if we just go to the next slide, I'd like everyone to stand up. And thinking about what we just heard from Evershed, I would like to ask who in this room, which of your organizations are only focused on the pains? You can sit down. You can sit down. And so the rest are also focused on some of the gains? No, you're only the pains. You can also sit down. Okay, so then in terms of the pains in this room, of those sitting in the standing up, what are some of the pains that you're facing? Anyone want to share a pain related to pay transparency?
It's not so much a pain right now. It's sort of anticipating the fact that we're gonna have trouble recruiting or having folks and having to create mailboxes where, same as in the US, we're gonna get lots of potential queries. So that's why the company is only focused on how do we mitigate that risk, that potential pain, rather than look at is there any gain, but not necessarily focused on that.
So that administrative burden.
Correct.
Okay. And those who are still standing up, who wants to share a gain that you're looking at? Anyone?
We've got multiple locations across the UK, and they all had a very local way of approaching pay. We brought it all in to be aligned and much more structured around job size, and we've seen that from a sort of transparency, fairness perspective for our dealership groups has been huge in terms of the trust that goes back into the organisation, that actually we do have logic, structure and fair processes that sit behind pay decisions. So that's been a real gain for us.
Okay, in terms of sharing that message and having that fairer approach to compensation. Interesting. All right, so Lisa, let's take a look. We heard about some of the pains and gains in the previous session, but you'd be amazed how many companies come to us and say they're actually considering putting aside a budget to pay for these government fines that could emerge for not complying with the pay gap reporting. If only that was the only pain. We know that there could also be these equal pay claims that we talked about. But I think Ruth will also share, there could be also reduced access to talent. We see that talent is actually less likely to apply for jobs, especially in the States, if they don't see that there's a pay range attached to it. We also could begin to see a reduced shareholder perception. I think that the talking about the outsourcing is a really interesting one. I think we're going to also see this interaction with the supply chain and the investor pressure, especially with the CSRD. It's going to be perhaps a focus area in terms of how companies are actually given access to funding and that shareholder perception. So there are a number of pains to consider, and on the flip side, we do see that there are these positive impacts which start with the enhanced brand, companies that are able to associate pay transparency. I think of a company like fidelity and the emphasis that you might place on transparency to your customers and your financial investors, why not have that same level of transparency with your employee base? We also can see that transparency can increase employee productivity. About 3 weeks ago, we did a really interesting case study with this Hungarian tech startup. They were a small organization, but actually have gone to be fully transparent. And by doing this, they actually saw a real uptick in the motivation of the staff because they could see, how they could progress. And it was interesting, even though that they were small, after the conversation, we had even the Amazons in the room come up to us and say, actually, they are disrupting things. We do see this impacting, our ability to attract talent. We can also see this as an opportunity to increase organizational efficiency. So yes, the job architecture is the foundation to pay transparency, but also going through that process can be an opportunity to look at efficiencies in how you're structured as an organization. And then finally, we mentioned the talent and attraction advantage of organizations that are able to look at and share more information around pay. But perhaps more importantly, we're able to drive these fairer workforce opportunities and really embed that in terms of what we want to do as an organization. And so, we can go to the next slide and we can see that this is not just a European or UK, although this is what we're focused on today. We had the great overview of the North America. But also in Asia Pacific and Latin America, we also have different requirements that are emerging and organizations that are beginning to consider this from a global perspective. And we recently ran a global pay transparency survey in the spring. Over 1,100 participants responded, and what we saw that 15% actually are having a global approach to this. 53% are looking at a global approach with some sort of regional adaptation. And when it comes to the different legislations, I think it'll be really interesting to see, what are those minimum standards that companies start to apply across the world. And Lucy will talk a little bit about the UK perspective, but it's potential that even things that emerge from the UK could then become global standards. Similarly, with the EU directive, it's really important to almost go line by line in terms of the requirements and understand what do we want to tackle from a global perspective, what do we need to look at regionally, and what requires that local input.
And I would add to that global approach has increased massively with the EU directive and that region-wide approach rather than just that focus historically in more of the Northern American region. So that recognition, as Lucy said, that it's moving around the world and that one direction of travel influencing other markets is influencing as well how organisations are looking at it, and therefore even in markets where you're not currently seeing any pressure, the move from a market standpoint around transparency is going to increase the pressure even where you haven't necessarily got the legislative piece.
So to wrap things up before I pass it over to Lucy, it's important to understand, as we were talking, that the pay gap is really the tip of the iceberg. It's what's publicly visible, but to really look at how you're going to embed this, it's important to understand your pay equity, your pay processes, your job architecture, to also consider this concept of career equity and the representation of workers coming into your organization and progressing through the organization, and how that's all linked back to your broader, diversity and inclusion ambition. So it all needs to come together. And when you do this, you can see that, there is a strong kind of business output. So we asked this recently in our global talent trends, what actually motivates employees to stay? And we can see that the number 2 reason is fair pay, just behind job security, which is really interesting. And I think what's even more interesting is this is actually above number 6, which is competitive rewards. So employees are ranking fairness and pay above market competitiveness. So food for thought. And then we also could see that companies that are high growth in our survey were 1.6 more likely to really be digging into the underneath lying reasons behind pay inequities and also looking to have kind of systematic approaches to close those gaps. So again, some food for thought in terms of, why do we need to look at pay transparency as an organization, not just from an HR perspective, but also from a business perspective. So, Lucy,
Fantastic.
over to you.
So we've talked a little bit about the kind of theoretical behind the why, and I know you're probably all here, so there's probably some of that why that stands to you. But also, before we get into breakouts and have more of a kind of practical conversation about it, we also wanted to pull out the kind of the tactical why, which is what are other people doing? So as Lucy said, we've done some both global and local in the UK, because I know that obviously the UK legislation isn't here, in terms of what's going on and what are your competitors doing. So a starting point really in terms of what is going on and looking at companies in the UK and those headquartered in the UK, what we see is that global approach is very visible in the UK. So 81% of companies in the UK taking a global strategy. Now that is not necessarily applying everything the same globally, but that is putting in place an approach that is globally consistent. So this is the direction we want to go down. This is what principles we have behind pay transparency globally. And we look at it tactically, 50% are looking to address it in the next 1 to 2 years or are already addressing it. And that's specifically in the UK. So that isn't just compliance driven. But only 29% of companies are prepared for the impact of global pay transparency requirements, which is probably not a surprise. We know that the requirements are very opaque, still require a lot of detail, and we also know that this is something fairly new, and for those of you being in the room, probably you might feel a recognition of that, only 29%. So how are they approaching it? And we've covered this in a little bit of detail in terms of that approach around global minimum standards, but not necessarily a global approach. You've still got a few that are looking at regional or country-based approaches. This is often where there's more of that delegation to country to manage things like reward, but it's a very small proportion. And when you're looking at countries that you don't have that legislative requirement, that's worth taking. What I think is super interesting is how companies approaching this from a that tactical perspective. What are they actually doing, and what are they going to be doing in the UK? And what you can see is they're actually going to look at sharing pay ranges internally and externally. So yes, even where this isn't a legal requirement, because we know that there's that direction of movement, over 50% of companies are looking to externally and internally take a standardized approach to sharing pay ranges. And that's beyond just complying with local laws. Only 22% are saying, well, where we're locally required to do it, we'll do it. And there are some that's still sitting on the bandwagon in terms of not really sure where we're going to be. And what is the drivers of this? Now, this is predominantly UK companies. Obviously, if we look at the global perspective, compliance comes top by a country mile. But if we look at a UK perspective, there is that broader piece, and that's why we've had the conversation at the beginning in terms of what are those broader drivers for pay transparency, what are the positives, because actually we know in the UK that companies are looking at it from beyond compliance to actually this is good for our reward values, this is good for helping us ensure equity. In our global survey, we saw that actually companies in the UK were more likely to say that they felt that pay transparency would drive greater pay equity than some of the other markets. And you can see that in therefore actually we're looking to be aligned with our broader reward principles, broader DEI principles, just our values from a values-driven transparency perspective. But we're not there yet. Only 4% of companies are currently sharing hiring pay ranges in the UK, 12% sharing employee pay ranges internally. We've got a long way to go. And that's despite the acknowledgement in the UK that it's an expectation for employees and a belief that pay transparency will improve pay equity. Actually, probably most of you will know this. You'll know the expectation, but there's a lot of fear around doing this. So what are we doing? We've got that fear. We're not doing the pay ranges yet. Where are we going to go? Where are we going now? Again, we're looking at it globally in blue, regionally in green. In purple is the only where required, and in this turquoise at the end is just not sharing anything. And this aligns to everything we've talked about, which is from a principles standpoint, they were going to take that global approach. But when we come to the more detailed pieces, your pay gaps, both your adjusted and your unadjusted, there's a much more where required approach. What I think is very interesting is this employee pay range and hiring pay range that historically would have been a where required piece that is moving towards actually either we're just not sharing it, or we're going to be sharing it in the future. But we know it differs by country. And it differs by country in terms of where they're ready to do it and where they're not ready to do it. So purple, where legally required. Blue is where we intend to be sharing information internally or externally more. And this kind of grey is actually we're not going to do it at all. And you can see that there are differences. Unsurprisingly, in Asia, where the legislation remains still fairly new, there's still a lot of hesitancy to take more steps in transparency. But when we look at Europe, actually there's more of a move to be doing it. And the UK, I mean, it's a huge drive for it. Okay, so how should you be prepared? How should you get to that point? We know that there's huge challenges around transparency. And it's not just challenges that Reward manage. That lack of employee understanding of compensation programs and practices. And actually, our most recent survey showed that actually one of the biggest concerns around pay gap reporting is employee understanding. As you raised, there's still a lot of misunderstanding from employees, from the media around what this means, and more broadly around what your compensation packages are. There's a lack of manager capability in managing difficult conversations around feedback, and therefore an understanding in terms of how compensation ties into it. And for everyone just maintaining an understanding of the global legislation, which is where that map comes in handy. Actually, we know that there's just so much concern around the legislation coming in and making sure you're understanding it. So what actions can you take? Some of this absolutely ties into what you've talked about before, which is creating a plan, starting with understanding where you are right now from 4 different principles. Understanding where your policies and practices are, what your job architecture is, where your workforce data is, and then from a pay equity standpoint, how fairly are you paying? And then what does your communications look like? How consistent is what you're communicating in rewards to what managers are communicating, and what you're communicating on an annual basis versus your broader principles? Starting with that understanding of where you are to be able to move forwards.
So when we look at the different companies in the room, we see that we have kind of 3 main categories. We have the resistors, the transformers, and the leaders. So again, I'm going to ask you, but I'm not going to ask you to stand up. I want to ask, do we have any leaders in the room? Does anyone confidently feel like they are a pay transparency and pay equity leader?
We're not that lucky.
Okay. We had 1 or 2 a couple of weeks ago. Do we have any resistors?
Well, resisting is not right, but to be frank, really, if the EU directive hadn't come in, I guess another way to reformulate the question is, would we be here worrying about this right now? And the honest answer is probably no. You know, so this is accelerating greatly that direction of travel, just as COVID accelerated remote working. It's that sort of. What hasn't helped though is still this lack of definition. So we can, I'm sure all of us understand how we pay. We do the male female in similar jobs, and we have that sort of data. But when you have really very opaque definitions like equal jobs or what is pay. So if I look at, if we look at long-term incentives, if we have share plans, is that part of it? How do you value a share plan? Is it now, we invest it, whatever. So all of these things, I think, are quite difficult. So I don't actually know, honestly, today what I'm supposed to measure. I know something's coming, and I'm told to prepare for it. But honestly, I'm not given enough information to prepare for what I'm supposed to measure. It's clear we don't know what we're going to measure. Equally, jobs of equal value. So, I could produce something that says this is my company's definition. Is that what somebody else's definition is going to be? Is it how the country is going to respond? Again, I don't know. So when I say resisting, I'm resisting because there's there's so many unknowns for me. At the moment, I'm in this sort of position where we're beginning to look at audits to see what we actually have got. And I'm trying to understand what we have got against a very vague context. So I'm doing it reluctantly, but really because it's not clear. I really don't have that clarity.
Okay. And so I guess the rest of you then are in that bucket of transforming. So we'll continue to go through this journey, and we'll continue to have more information, which makes it a little bit more clear, but also probably a lot more murky, knowing compliance legislation.
So just to be clear, I will have to transform.
At some point, but you want to meet legal compliance as a priority. Okay.
So I'm
Yeah. Cool. So what can we do to prepare? We had shared this checklist tool with you prior, but what we thought we would do today is have some conversations. So we have a couple of questions that are tied to each of these pillars: job architecture, pay equity, pay policies, and then the people and culture, which we've printed out. And we thought that if we kind of split up into groups that are more focused on one topic area versus another, this could be a way to get a little bit more granular into the discussion and also learn from one another. And so I'll just kind of place questions, and maybe just a show of hands, how many are interested in job architecture? Okay, so that's like one table. How about pay equity? How many want to discuss it today? Discuss it today. How many people would like to discuss pay equity today? One. Okay. You can. 2, 3. Okay. Well, I'll bring that one back there. That's easier. Pay policies. Pay policies. Okay. We'll put that one to this one. And people and culture. Yeah.
All of it. Yeah.
Okay. All of it. You want a couple?
Yeah, you can absolutely cover a few. The goal is to think about, because we know that there's so much to cover on all of these topics. We know that for all of you, it's a where do we start?
Job architecture is good.
And that's
Okay.
why having a single
Job
topic to
architecture.
go, okay, where are we starting when we think about
Choices.
our job architecture? Actually, how do we define agenda-neutral objective factors? And the understanding that Sweden is likely to direct you towards a points-based evaluation system, how ready are you for that? On when it comes to pay equity, if that's a priority for you, actually, what sort of pay equity, what sort of level of understanding do we have around pay equity? To your question earlier, what payments are we including in pay equity? Even if you're doing that analysis, you might only be looking at base pay plus some of your incentives. You might be excluding things that the EU directive has included in pay, and to what extent are you ready to understand that? Pensions, but also your benefits plans more broadly. To what extent do you understand the gaps in those? When we're thinking about policy, how clear are your policies? How well governed are they? To what extent are they being followed versus do you have flex in them? And then when we're thinking about that people and culture, to what extent are you communicating things effectively? To what extent do you feel that employees actually know their benefits, for example, know their compensation, understand those sorts of things? So that's kind of what we mean when we're talking about all of these four.